Thank you very much, Eddie. The trouble with introductions like that is you tend to look around and wonder who the hell they're talking about. Anyway, I really am very grateful. Unfortunately, I've nothing, what I would say, prepared for an audience of this distinction. So what you're going to get is a stream of consciousness, and I hope it doesn't turn into a stagnant pool. I'm really going to be responding to what I've seen in the papers. I only got here last night, and I'll talk a little bit about one or two things about last night. What I've seen in the papers in terms of issues that have arisen, and I'll simply give very short comments on them in a way. And do we have questions afterwards? I don't know. Yes, we have. Okay, well, then things can come up in questions. But I wanted to begin talking about reflections on Irish political culture, which is what they were really about. And there was quite a lot of commentary on localism and the virus or the curse of localism in Irish politics, I suppose, in Irish life in general, perhaps. And I happen to think localism could be one of our... We have localism, but everywhere has localism, by the way. Could be one of our greatest assets if we knew how to use it properly. The challenge for us is to harness localism constructively instead of stifling it by I still adhere to the view of grossly over-centralised institutional state and perhaps over-centralised country in general terms. And this is not an anti-Dublin rant, by the way, because most of Dublin also, in my view, suffers from over-centralisation in terms of if you take 3 or 4 of the postal codes of Dublin out of it, then the rest of Dublin belongs to the rest of the country in terms of the way it's looked at by the dominant postal codes, the dominant decision makers. We have, even at this conference, we have, if you go to the list there, which I happen to do, something like 3/4 of all the speakers. Not just come from Dublin, because I'm leaving out the TDs from constituencies outside and so on, who spend a lot of their time in Dublin but aren't of it, are from Dublin. And that's partly because we have, virtually uniquely in the Western world, we have all our capitals in Dublin. Our political capital, our economic capital, our financial capital, and perhaps nowadays, most important of all, our media capital. If one looks at the media situation a century ago and compares it with today, there's simply no comparison in terms of the growth in the dominance of Dublin-based media. Then obviously they're not all from Dublin as such. Nevertheless, the perspective tends inevitably to be from that limited area within Dublin and the limited circles in which these people move. And this has nothing to do with them. We actually have very nice, gifted and talented people in all those areas, but they simply acquire the silent perspectives in a way. So they're not forced to ask themselves, maybe I should say we're not forced to ask ourselves in many ways, where do we get our ideas from, where do our perspectives come from, why do we think the way we think? It's far more important to know why we think what we think than to know what we think. We all know what we think. Why we think what we think is the sort of question we don't put to ourselves very often. And when you're moving in the same circles all the time, seeing the same faces, etc., terrific faces, by the way, I see some of them here, but nonetheless it induces a sense of almost somnolence in terms of one sleepwalks through one's assumptions and one brings them with one. So I do think that localism, which we find everywhere, is used or not used by central authority in constructive ways. It is not used constructively in Ireland. It is regarded as a pest, basically. It is a threat to the superior world view of the philosopher kings who would be, if only they were left alone to do their philosopher king things, but they have to take cognizance of these mortals who keep following up their lives with demands for wretched little handouts to whatever their wretched little parish happens to be, and except that you pay compliments when you're there, of course, but beyond that you move on very fast. Every country I've lived in, and that would be mainly German-speaking Central Europe and the United States, apart from England, has very highly developed local consciousness. It's not that they're not locally conscious. They're very highly developed locally conscious. The big difference is they don't have anything like a centralised decision-making systems. In this country, we insist on bringing the local into the central all the time. That's why you are, if you're in Dublin or if you're in Leinster House or wherever, or if you're in government departments, you're conscious of the pressure of local demands and local interests. It's because many of those in other countries would not reach that stage at all. They would be dealt with locally in proper systems of local decision-making. The test is always money. Where does the money come from? And we have an extraordinary centralised exchequer system. Now, I know there were reasons for it. Some of them actually were good, not all by any means. And I'm not setting up the local versus the national as the ideal versus some sort of pollution of it. That's not the case. There's good and bad in both. There's strengths and weaknesses in both. But if you live, as I do nowadays, in New York City most of the time, the difference with Ireland strikes you straight away. You have 3 taxes to pay. Now, that may not appear a great gain for those who are accustomed to one taxation system, but you have your federal tax, which goes to Washington, D.C. You have your state tax, which goes up to Albany, and you have your city tax, which stays in New York City. You have an extremely powerful mayoral system, where a large number of the sorts of issues that are central government issues here are in fact local government issues. I'm not saying they're dealt with necessarily more brilliantly all the time, but you don't have the same sense of constant importunity from the central exchequer of locals. And that transforms one's perspective on the potential of harnessing local energies as distinct from stifling them, which is the impression one gets from a lot of public comment in this country, particularly, as I say, by the philosopher types, who almost have a visceral, emotional reluctance and resentment against, it seems to me, the constant plethora of demands, which is understandable because that's what's there. There is a constant plethora of demands coming from the local to the national, but as I said, that's because the national insists on it happening that particular way. Likewise, in German-speaking sense, whether you're in Germany itself, which is a big country, whether you're in Switzerland or Austria, there are very different routes to national decision-making and to effective local decision-making. And money is obviously crucial in them in many ways. Now, I don't want to oversimplify unduly, and I am oversimplifying, but I'm bound to in this context. But I'm simply saying that our perspectives on the relation between the national and the local would seem to me to be crucial to the effective mobilization of public opinion in this country for unpopular decisions, among lots of other things, needs to be really looked at seriously at this particular stage. It's not just we have centralization. We have, what's worse again, we have centralization with incoherence. The most frightening comment I heard here last night was from Sean O'Driscoll, standing here saying that he found himself in a room with the Secretary Generals, I think, of 7 economics departments, or 7 Secretary Generals, and they hardly seem to know one another. Now, I have no idea who's involved or what's involved, and I know that there are many organisations in Dublin which try to pull people together. But the idea that you can have so centralised a structure, with apparently a lot of independent republics within that structure, seems to me to be getting the worst of both worlds. So, assuming that what Sean says is right, and that's in one particular area, that's not, covering everything all the time. I think he called it a silo system. Centralisation with coherence may have something to be said for it. Centralisation without coherence most certainly does not. And then it breaks everybody down. Everybody becomes an interest group, including those who think they are the ones saving the public purse from the pressures of the grasping paws of interest groups. Now, that is sometimes linked in public commentary with our electoral system, with proportional representation. I actually happen to think PR serves the country pretty well. The arguments I've seen against it, and that virtually any alternative electoral system is preferable, may in theory carry some conviction. But if you look at those electoral systems we're advised to pay close attention to or to perhaps adopt, you'll see that across the world they exist in extremely well-run countries and they exist in extremely badly run countries. There's no correlation between the electoral system and the quality of national performance that I can see, admittedly at a pretty quick glance, in these things. If you look at the PIGS, or whatever they're pronounced, PIIGS, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain, plus in Hungary from last week, presumably, so if we do it PH, it becomes FIGS, it's from PIGS. None of the others have our electoral system, but they've bloody well got the same sort of problem that we managed to devise. So if you want to link electoral system to nature of problem, you're going to have to push pretty hard. In other words, systematic comparison, which is the basis of any attempt to change our systems and choose others in preference, systematic comparison has to be done seriously and not simply pluck individual examples from around the globe as happens to apparently suit oneself. They probably don't stand up either, by the way, if the exercise is done that superficially. So unless there's a good reason, a reason can come up to change PR, our existing system, And obviously that's tied up with local and central also, so these things are interrelated. The strongest case, however, for our current electoral system, it seems to me, is that it seems to be broadly accepted as fair by the big majority of the population. And fairness is an absolutely crucial glue in holding together the idea of a society. Otherwise, the concept of society crumbles if there is not a feeling that, for all its faults, it is by and large fair. Kenny last night spoke about fairness several times, and in interesting ways, but as incidental to individual points as a thing for making it a central issue. How a society acquires its sense of fairness, what it considers to be fair, which is really a question of emotional intelligence far more than of academic intelligence. You know, I'm not constitutionally hostile to academic intelligence, but in fact emotional intelligence is far more important for bonding a society together than intellectual intelligence is in the narrow sense. And as long as people regard a system as fair, then, I mean, there may be things to outsiders that look daft, but it is very important for that system. I mean, if we look across the water, I imagine I'm not the only one in this country who would regard the massive majorities that Maggie Thatcher on the one hand and Tony Blair on the other got in Parliament on the basis of fairly narrow victories in electoral terms and voting terms in the elections as extraordinary and indeed as unfair. But if they were satisfied with it, if that electorate was satisfied with it, then good luck to them. There's now a proposal for change with nothing to do with fairness, as a matter of fact. It's got to do with purely calculation of the odds in terms of how things will go. So as long as the electoral system is deemed to be fair, I think we should stick to it. Now that sense of fairness brings me on to something else about fairness in general, because I do think one of the problems challenging this country in the current crisis, and it could deteriorate very much more, is if a sense of fairness in the response to the crisis as to who suffers, who pays, etc., if there is not a genuine conviction amongst the vast majority of the population that what's being done is fair, not so much is it harsh. Everybody knows things are going to have to be harsh, and are harsh already for many people, but is it fair that there could be very serious problems that are not anticipated at this particular moment? And I want to move on. I'm going to quote something which you probably never thought was going to be quoted here. Maybe it's been quoted already, I don't know. I'm going to go back to that most derided speech in modern Irish history, Mr. de Valera's dream speech of 1943. Now, Mr. de Valera aroused a strong reaction still, so I'm not saying anything in particular about this. So I will say Mr. de Valera is a politician. You don't win 8 general elections without thinking about politics. And this is an election speech, by the way. But he also was more than a politician because he had a genius for managing to somehow relate the mundanities of the present to the eternal verities, of which, of course, he was the divinely appointed spokesman. It was a fantastic performance, absolutely fantastic, just as a performance. You can like or dislike, or that's beside the point. But let me quote, and then I will tell you why I'm quoting it. That Ireland which we dreamed of, so this is a dream speech, etc. And this is the basis for right living, etc. A land whose countryside would be bright with cosy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, with the romping of sturdy children, the contest of athletic youths, and the laughter of comely maidens, whose firesides would be forums for the wisdom of serene old age. Now, they are, as I say, the most derided lines in recent, and by recent I mean the last 20 years, preppy comment by the younger generation. And you can see why, in a way. The language is archaic, obviously, but he was a Victorian, so that was standard language. The aspirations are highly romantic. There's no dancing at the crossroads, by the way, which is the way it's normally quoted. Anybody who quotes the dream speech has dancing with the crossroads is saying, I have never looked at it. And that means nearly everybody who quotes it. Mind you, it's not incompatible with the general spirit of it, shall we say, but it's not there. But what's it about? It's about healthy children. This is a dream, by the way, remember. It's about healthy children. It's about teenagers enjoying themselves. It's about adults who are employed at broadly agreeable work. And it's about the elderly being respected. That's what's behind all this Victorian language. In other words, it's about relations between the generations. And that seems to me to be one of the most important questions confronting this country at this time, is relationship between the generations. Because they have changed dramatically in recent years. They've changed dramatically with what I would call the televisionization of youth, or of at least into early middle age, where they've changed dramatically, obviously, with far more women going out to work now. because it would have been the women who most of the time looked after the elderly, who were kept at home. So the prospects for the elderly have changed dramatically over the last 20, 30 years in terms of how the last 10, 20 years of their lives are going to be spent. And as life expectancy increases, and remember that until maybe 100 years ago, life expectancy remained fairly static for a very long time. The changes in health, etc., over the last century have dramatically changed the age structures of society. And the society didn't change to adapt to that because it was simply assumed that the elderly would be taken care of and their families, the family would do everything. More recently, that is changing and changing rapidly. And of course, it's changing without there being adequate legislation, etc., without us being abreast of what's happening, or even ahead of what's happening, rather than trying to catch up with what's happening, leading to an awful lot of, it seems to me, unnecessary suffering, but psychological suffering, which we probably don't see, physical suffering, which we sometimes see some horror story in the paper about, and that's that, and then it passes on, etc. As life expectancy increases, as working habits have changed dramatically, then we need to rethink very fundamentally what the role of elderly in society is. It can come back to things like retirement ages, which are now on the book in a variety of ways, but for other reasons entirely. There are huge social consequences, social implications of this, and we really have not begun to think systematically about that at all. That's why, as it so happens, I've been seeing things in the Irish Times about recommendations that pensioners should have their allowances cut or whatever is going to happen in the next 3 billion swad. If I were, well, let's leave that aside. If I were in the country, I would be mad as hell at that sort of thing. Because if you think of what this particular transitional elderly generation is going through, because they're the first to have met the full force of that age in the percentage they're getting. This is a generation that was born in the 1930s, 1940s. They grew up in the 40s and 50s, in some of the bleakest years this country's ever had, where opportunities were extremely limited. They're the ones who were left behind when 500,000 got out in the 1950s. Many of them had to go into jobs that weren't their first choice or second choice or third choice and stay in those jobs for 30 or 40 years if they were there. I think the percentage, I'm open to correction here, but I think the percentage of the age group going to university in the late 1950s was 4%. And they were not Institute of Technology. In other words, they did not have anything like the opportunities that emerged, and thank God emerged so rapidly in subsequent generations. They have borne the heat of the day, and they're entitled to a twilight of peace, as far as I'm concerned. And it seems to me that those dimensions, those aspects should be kept in mind in the interest of fairness. And I don't think there would be a mass negative reaction to that if government were to make that type of argument in terms of equity, generational equity in the society. It has to be addressed anyway as a major potential confrontational issue in society. And the sooner we look at it systematically, as distinct from waiting for demonstrations and grey power and things like that, if there are demonstrations, I would be for them, let me put it like that, if in fact that type of dimension is not stitched into government thinking about where cuts should fall. So that's an aspect that seems to me that we need to pay far more attention to. What about the future in that sense? And here I move from that to, in a way, to the younger one, to the role of education. I'm not going to say very much. There are far more eminent education than myself in the room, and there will be more in due course. But it seems to me, and Eamon Ryan last night said education is the most important single thing. We have basically, and there was a discussion yesterday, I wasn't here, so my apologies if I'm repeating what was said by other people. We have educated basically for a static society, historically. We have entered a society of very rapid change. We don't know where it's going to be going, but we know it's going to be changing. And those changes require thinking outside the box a great deal of the time. So we need to foster, and there's nothing new in what I'm saying, we need to foster creative intelligences which are able to stand outside the acquired wisdom, the acquired teaching. Now, there's all sorts of schemes nowadays about teaching, and about checking teaching and ticking boxes and all the rest of it. My apologies to anybody here who has had to devise those schemes. And they're not, on balance, they're probably all right. Or they may be marginally better. I have to say this. I did history and economics in UCD nearly 50 years ago. I've taught in several universities since. I've taught in several countries since. I have never met better teaching than I had from my teachers in UCD. And nobody taught them how to teach. Now, there are bloody awful teachers there as well, by the way. All right? But you could not teach what my teachers had. They either had it or they didn't have it, or they had the type of disposition which was willing to go that extra mile in terms of making themselves great teachers. So what we need, it seems to me, and it's very hard to do it, because when we're talking about education, the first people we tend to look at students, pupils, students. Right, the first people we look at are the teachers, because they're the ones who have to actually educate the younger people. I know very little about teacher education, very little. But I do think that with the way examinations, when you look at exam paper, you say, my God, they're not asking that question again, are they? Oh, they're not asking that question, but they're asking a bloody stupid question instead of it. You have to ask, what are the teachers expected to inculcate? Because teachers will teach to examine papers. They have to. They have no choice. I did it myself. You know, university students will do it also. So one has to look at teacher training at all levels, it seems to me, as a key variable in the input of the quality of thinking in this society in coming generations. And I don't know how to do it, by the way. I'm not an expert in that area. But it has to be done. One has to inculcate, static bodies of knowledge up to a point in certain ways. But the basic inculcation is actually how to continue learning, how to continue thinking for oneself once the formal education is over. That's what the educated mind is about. It's not about I know things. It's about I know how to learn things. And I would be putting another lot of emphasis on that. If that's done, then I'm not going to say what sort of republic I would like to see, because I would say it's up to the generations to come to decide for themselves what republic they would like to see. But if they're taught in that way, then they will be able to decide better than any of us here can decide for them, or try to decide for them what they ought to have. If they're not taught in that way, then we're going to be much more at the mercy of being buffeted in a variety of ways again, it seems to me. So I would put the quality of teaching measured by how one educates people to think independently for themselves, to step outside themselves, to come back to that question I came in with at the beginning, why do we think what we think? That to me is one of the huge challenges confronting pedagogy of all types in this country. And if they do that, then in my view, and it's something I agree very much with Paddy Kelly said this morning, that fascinating presentation of his, that Ireland simply has not achieved its potential. Even though we've done some things very, very well. By and large, we've done the politics well. We take political stability for granted in this country. Nobody 100 years ago would have predicted political stability for Ireland in the light of what happened at that stage. They weren't predicting. Just go back to the predictions about what the Irish would do with themselves once they got their own government. And we can criticise any number of aspects, but there are a lot of positives in this Ireland. I came up by bus from Dublin yesterday, and I know it's a very superficial and a very transient view, but I haven't been over that route, I haven't been through Meath and Cavan for 15 years. I was astonished at the quality of housing that one passed along the way on the bus. And okay, it was along by the side of the road and you can be condemned, right? But they were good houses, they were by and large reasonably designed houses, they were well cared for gardens. It was very comforting in many ways, very reassuring to come and see some of what, I know piles have been squandered. But piles will always be squandered. You try and reduce the size of the pile, obviously, but there will always be squandered. The question is, do you get something good out of it? And you try to get more good, obviously, than before. But it seems to me that we must be doing something right in this country. We're now all depressed because of the way the tsunami hit, etc., etc. And in retrospect, obviously, and for some at the time, it appears almost incomprehensible how we let things get out of control. And there are serious weaknesses, which are systemic weaknesses in the way things got out of control, and not simply individual bad judgment, and they have to be addressed. But I'm looking beyond that, because they will be addressed in some shape or form over the next 5 years. I'm looking beyond that to the type of Ireland that could be here when one pulls out of the morass we've got ourselves into. That future is there. It's a future for the younger generations. It's up to us to give the type of guidance to allow them reach the best decisions possible for themselves and for the country. And if they do that, that's the type of republic I want to see.